can you imagine being locked up in a room, forced to be composing, and just stay there till somebody comes and tells you if what you have done was good or not good enough, and then you have to redo it all again? Well, that was a reality for a couple people some 300 years ago. Now, we are going to look into today's episode at what exactly went on there. I think it's a crazy thing to have highly talented people locked up writing stuff for you. However, without further ado, let's start with the newest episode of the Well-Tempered Cast. Hello and welcome to the Well-Tempered Cast, a podcast for Baroque music, Baroque culture, everything related to historical performance practice, historically informed performance, historical keyboard instruments, and so on. My name is Nenad Leonart. I'm a harpsichordist that has studied this for a couple years. I have grown to be one of the more influential social media channels on this topic, and today, as well, in the other episodes, we share about Baroque culture. Now, why we do that is kind of very simple. It is my mission to bring this music that I love so much to as many people as possible. And in order to do so, it is also important to understand what our commonalities are. Like, why do I enjoy the music from back then? Why am I fascinated by these Baroque thoughts, ideas, artworks, anything that came out of there? I feel like a strong affinity, a strong passion towards it. And obviously, I've been thinking about this a long time. I've been studying a lot of sources, a lot of different ideas that are out there. And this podcast is kind of a compilation of all of those just for you, to bring you the essence of the matter, so that you can understand this culture better, so you can understand the music better, and so that it's also easier for you to bring this music to other people when you are performing, when you are creating programs, when you are even just like curating your playlist on Spotify. This is why I want to do that, because everything had meaning back then. A lot of it got forgotten, and now it's on us to rediscover this meaning and to absolutely cherish these artworks. Now, we are right now in a 4-part series about Baroque life, how life was back then, how people lived, what they thought about, what their ideas were. And basically, I don't think that they were much different from us today in terms of emotions, in terms of feeling happy, unhappy, having to go through crisis, having great moments, but also low points. And this is a connection that I feel throughout the centuries. On the other hand, we have very different circumstances in their lives, like how their everyday life looked like, what were the technological developments at that time, what could be done and couldn't be done. And so we're covering these in these episodes. We've already talked about daily life and society in episode 1, and about technological and scientific advancements in episode 2. This is number 3, where we're going to talk about culture and culture work. And in the episode number 4, we are going to look at Baroque worldviews. Now, before we start into the episode, I want to use a contemporary source to just really bring you this idea why it is so important to go and check out what these people were doing, how they lived their lives, everything around it. And this is by one of my favorite authors, which is Stephen Covey. He is into self-development. I think he wrote a couple books that were really important actually for managers and people in higher positions. However, the reason why I'm using it is because it has a lot of wisdom to it. I really enjoyed his book that is called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And obviously I want it to be highly effective as well, right? So I checked that one out, and there's habit number 5, which is the most important habit, as he says from the book, that nothing ever helped him in relationships as much as this habit number 5. And it goes as follows. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. I will repeat it again. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Why this habit is in there and why it's worded like this is that usually in our lives we do the opposite. Speaking, playing, presenting, sharing with others, sure. But what about listening? Like actual listening. What training do we go through in our lives that kind of enables us so that we can really deeply understand others, even each other? There's so much miscommunication going on. And this habit, seek first to understand and then to be understood, it's about going out and listening really deeply before we even speak. Now, our default tendency is to get our point across. This is just how we work as human beings. We want to kind of overshare, right? Because we want to get noticed. And I see this in the music field a lot. Everybody's talking about their own ideas, what they think about this work, what this thing is meaning or the importance of it, and so on. But first of all, we may ignore the other person completely in what they want, what they're interested in, and what they are actually paying attention to. So we get a disconnect over there. But on the other hand, we also can get disconnected with this kind of thinking from the ideas and the ideals of the Baroque era and the original composer who wrote this work for a specific reason. Now, is there possibility for artistic freedom? Is there possibility for, changing up things? Of course there is. Of course there is. But if we are not aware of it, if we have no training in listening, in paying attention to others, then it's kind of getting really hard, really, really hard to make meaningful art, and especially in the times where classical musicians are losing the audience more and more. This is one of the main points for me to get across to you. If we are not doing this on a regular basis, we are going to have problems long term. So, it's about learning to suspend our desire to respond automatically. It is about learning that before we take something for granted or we know what this thing is about, to go a level deeper or 2 levels deeper and actually start questioning what is behind this. It's about practicing a more intentional kind of listening, not just being on autopilot. And then, when it's our time to be understood, we are really well equipped with a lot of different tools that we kind of picked up through listening so that we can really create meaningful sharing with each other. And for this, here's a story that's directly from Stephen Covey's book that I'm going to read to you right now. I always cite this. This has literally changed my life. Here it goes. I was riding on a subway on Sunday morning in New York. People were sitting quietly, reading papers or resting with eyes closed. It was a peaceful scene. Then a man and his children entered the subway car. The man sat next to me and closed his eyes, apparently oblivious to his children who were yelling, throwing things, even grabbing people's papers. I couldn't believe he could be so insensitive. Eventually, with what I felt was unusual patience, I turned and said, "Sir, your children are disturbing people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more?" The man lifted his gaze as if he saw the situation for the first time. "Oh, you're right," he said softly. "I guess I should do something about it. we just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either. Suddenly, I saw things differently. And because I saw differently, I felt differently. I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. I didn't have to worry about controlling my attitude or my behavior. My heart filled with compassion. Your wife died? Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you tell me about it? What can I do to help? Everything changed in an instant. And so the takeaway from really, really carefully paying attention and listening is this. When our perception changes, when we allow our perception to change through this, emotion and behavior change automatically with it. When we open ourselves up to other people or to these historical contexts, when we really go and look deeply, trying to find the answers, everything about how we think, how we feel, how we create this music will change. And this will not just help you grow as an artist, this will also help you grow as a human being. Because you will be paying more attention to your colleagues, to your family members, to everybody around you. And I think this is one of the most important skills that we can develop as artists and as humans. Now let's move on to Baroque culture and how culture and work looked like back then. First of all, obviously, the most important part of culture back then, I would say, was death and their relationship on many different levels to death and the afterlife. So that's absolute number one. Without understanding the Baroque concept of death, you cannot understand Baroque, period, at all. So let's start with number one, the preoccupation with death and the afterlife in the Baroque era. It was marked by an intense awareness of death back then and the afterlife, which is a reflection of the era's fragile existence of people. We have a lot of wars, we have a lot of plague, sicknesses, high mortality rates, religious conflicts all over. And this ever-present reality kind of shaped their culture and also what kind of art they created. Also, it found its place into daily life. So when death being ever-present, you had a short life expectancy, on average 30 to 40 years, although those who actually survived childhood, they lived a little bit longer. Then we have diseases, right? The plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, and medicine was nowhere, as we've covered in the last episode. We have several wars going on at the same time, devastating Europe, and we also have very high infant mortality rates. So, with death being so close to daily life, people developed a heightened focus on salvation, on the afterlife, and the preparation for judgment. Memento mori is the quote from that time. Memento mori is very important, meaning is Latin for remember that you must die. It's a widespread artistic and philosophical theme, supposing to remind people that death was inevitable and that they should live piously to secure their place in the afterlife. So everything that they were doing here, even though life here wasn't great and death was ever present and you kind of feared death, right? You were still supposed to live in a way that will secure you a place for a better afterlife, looking forward to the afterlife. So in paintings, we often find skulls, wilting flowers, we find clocks, we find extinguished candles as these symbols of life passing by. And obviously we have also reflected this in music in many different forms. Now, the important difference to what we have today is that when today you say to somebody, hey, memento mori, just remember that you have to die. So oftentimes you would also say it with carpe diem, which means pluck the day, right? When people would do that today, it means more like, okay, live life fully because it's not going to go on forever. So just enjoy as much as you can in the time that you have here. Back then, it did not mean that. It meant one day you will be judged, and it is coming, so you better watch out what you're doing right here, right now. Huge difference. Kind of same words. The concept of vanitas, the fleeting nature of earthly pleasures, right? Today's memento mori, earthly pleasures, back then, less so. Vanitas is kind of empty. This another visual reminder of mortality, like in the paintings, where you have, let's say, luxurious objects alongside symbols of decay, like rotting fruit or fading flowers. So kind of symbolizing that it's meaningless. These artworks reinforce the idea that wealth, that beauty, that any kind of earthly achievement was meaningless in the face of death. Message being, only spiritual preparation mattered in the end. And it's also interesting to look from this perspective at the work of different composers. Most composers that we have today, they wrote like situational things. Something was needed, okay, then they wrote it. You needed a cantata for this weekend, you wrote it. You needed like a concerto for this occasion, you wrote it. And then it was kind of just like a skill that was used over and over again, depending on the demand of the time. Bach would have been one of the first, if not the first at all, to have this idea of his works existing after him and to create like a structure, almost like an architectural structure of his works that will live past him. And that's very, very, very interesting to understand. Later we will also go into the fashion styles and so on, but like, he was, I think, one of the absolute singular geniuses that was also preoccupied in his brain with what am I going to leave when I leave this earth? Like, what are the next generations gonna have? And you can see this in his style and the way how he collected works, how he wrote them down, and how he planned everything out. I'm sure we'll do an episode on just how like he structurally planned out his publications of the Klavierübungen and so on. Just to have this idea of a summary. He was summarizing the styles that he grew up with from different countries, from different influences, and just to leave them like as a, not necessarily an average, but as a completed form, a completed style. He wanted to complete everything and leave that to posterity, which is absolutely amazing for somebody at that time to have this thought. You will not find it with other composers. The afterlife was, in fact, the ultimate concern back at the time. So usually, people would be very, very deeply religiously devoted, up to the point that I have been having discussions if, let's say, like in Protestant Germany, where having children was a duty, were people actually indulging even in sexual pleasures with each other, or was that just like a duty that you had to do so you fulfill your marital obligations and you have children and offspring, right? This is what I'm really wondering, like how much split off were they actually from these pleasurable things back then, right? It's a ground for pretty interesting discussions. Like, again, Bach having 20-something children. Yeah, was he like just really fond of doing that, or was it out of obligation? Let's discuss, but not this time. So you had obviously also the fear of hell. That was more in the Catholic region. Everybody basically emphasized the importance of leading a righteous life. So funerals were also grand affairs, and you have oftentimes also elaborate musical compositions for these. You have like requiem masses, but you have that also in Protestant Germany, like cantatas for the passing of somebody and so on. Basically, the church was the only instance that guided people through death. Like art reflected it, everyday life reflected it, everything, but church was at the center of life and death. And they were kind of the most important focal point of all that was going on culturally. We also talked about that in the first episode, how actually important the churches were and what they said, the rules they set, and so on. This goes also for death and the afterlife. Now let's move on to the next point, which is enough talk about death. Let's talk about clothing and manners back then, okay? So clothing, basically fashion, that was a marker of social status back then. You had elaborate wigs, you had corsets, rich fabrics, and different classes would have different styles of these, right? So people dressed to protect their role and position within their class. Social hierarchy was bread and butter. Like you knew where you were and you couldn't just move through different classes. Even small deviations from these societal norms, either in dress or in behavior, they could lead to you being banished. Having severe punishment, being excluded from the society. So, yeah, it was just how it was. The rules. And the lack of distinct subcultures that we have today. You can basically go anywhere and find your subculture. You can find, I don't know, Hello Kitty fans. You can find heavy metal fans. You can find gamers. You can find people who go to the theater. You can find classical musicians. Obviously, there's so many like subcultural communities today, but back then, you had one tribe that was your class. Like you belonged to that one. You couldn't just go out and create something new. And this formality extended to speech, to gestures, to social interactions. So all of these dictated how you were behaving, how you were dressing, and how your life looked like. Being part of that community was essential for survival, obviously, and also your reputation in that community. It's a world where everybody knows everybody else. If you want to marry well, you need to behave. If you want to work well with others, you need to behave. If you want to have any kind of relationship. So the constraints were very high and tolerance was very low, in fact. This leads me to the next point, number 3, which means that not everyone was equal at the time. On the contrary, people were extremely unequal, and we don't have this perception as much today, right? When we're talking about not equal or so, maybe people think about billionaires and the rest, or maybe they think about remnants of slavery, racism, stuff like that. Back then, there was a very, very different perception, like about not being equal. This is not just about race, it's not just about riches. It went much further into blood, like the nobility. It went into God-given rights to be a ruler, to be a king, to be a clergyman. So you had kind of, in this hierarchy, the better ones and the worse ones. And this is also reflected in the art, and interestingly enough, also in music. And you can really notice this development. So inequality was directly embedded in the musical language. You have a rhythmic structure of a bar, and then you have like the good beats, right, the strong ones, and then you have the off beats, which are the weak ones. You still need both to work, right? But the ones are just better, and the other ones aren't. And funnily enough, for the better ones, you have stricter rules. So what can be on a downbeat, on a strong beat of a bar? There's certain rules, how to do parallels, how to do consonances, and so on. And like the weaker ones were mostly used to fill out with notes, let's say. And so oftentimes, if you would just try to analyze like the weaker bars, they don't necessarily have strong harmonical structure, for example. They're much more used as filling out the composition. But this also goes on a smaller level. Just, for example, the idea of inégalité, how to play French music, right? When you go da 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 da. When you have the rhythm of the notes notated like they look the same, but everybody knows we don't play those the same. You have the ones on the downbeats that are larger, they take more space, they're more important, and the ones that follow, they're kind of not necessarily the servant. I don't know the exact expression that they use for this, but they are just not the most important note. So you have the note inégale in France. But also, you have the same thing with harmonies, right? You have the temperaments, the tuning system, where you have good-sounding harmonies and bad-sounding ones, depending on how you distribute the comma. And then you have maybe perfect thirds or perfect fifths in certain tonalities. And then if you move, let's say, to F sharp major, that really sounds bad, doesn't it? Interesting thing, this goes on up until the French Revolution, more or less. And this is just how the world is. This is just how the world works. We have ideas from Bach, for example, where he did the well-tempered clavier, and then he kind of tried to use all the tonalities. Again, he's not saying that they are all the same. They all have functions, and the tuning that he used with extremely high probability wasn't like an equal tuning that we do today. You still had different colors and different like strength and beauty inside of these harmonies. And so F major could be used for happy and open things. G major would be for even more extrovert stuff, while D major would be very dark and for melancholy, right? So you have different tonalities representing different things. Basically, if you want to look into this, you have very good explanations by Matteson and others from that time, looking at the intervals, looking at the tonalities, like what they express, what they are being used for, and you will notice that the character of the pieces, they oftentimes fit to each other within these tonalities. Let's move to the next one, which is number 4, manual labor. That was the one thing that was dominant, manual labor. Most people worked in physically demanding jobs, such as farming, tailoring, building. And the knowledge work as we know it today, that was extremely rare and just limited to like clergy, to scholars, and a few privileged professions like doctors and lawyers. This reliance on manual labor, that also influenced how leisure and culture were perceived. Art and music were kind of very rare treats for most people, accessible primarily through the church, where you had music, or through community events. Let's say you went on dancing in the evening. Otherwise, no art, no music whatsoever. And the manual labor that everybody had to do, this didn't just extend to work. This also extended to house chores, to everything you had to take care yourself, right? Today we have a specialist, you just call them over, they come, but back then, you need really to do a lot of things yourself. And we have a very interesting sentence in The Art of Playing the Harpsichord by François Couperin, where he says, well, the ones with not doing hard manual labor, like they're much better predisposed to play the harpsichord. So if you want to learn to play well, you are not supposed to do hard manual labor. Like he explicitly writes it there. And I think also that he mentions that that is why like young girls are better suited to learn the details of the harpsichord, because they just have these fine hands that are not being abused through probably, I don't know, carrying coals to heat your room or whatever. Let's move on to number 5, which kind of connects to this manual labor, which are the instruments that we have back then. They were obviously handmade, but they were also very individual. Today, you have like standardized instruments. You have a standardized piano, key, size. You have standardized violins, woodwinds. Like all of these, they're more or less the same. And if there's any innovation, it's like 0.5% or something that makes the sound even better or brighter, or you get more sustain. I don't know. Back then, every instrument was like a new plaything. Let's try and experiment with this one, or let's build it for exactly this purpose. You had no standardized thing. So every maker would have their style. They would have their sound. They would have their certain type of preference, how they created things. And that is why also today, when we look at these things, you have these different directions that you can go with instrument building. And I'm really happy to look at this more in detail with in a future episode with a luthier or like a harpsichord builder, like how these differences were to come about in the different makers and why they did those, and like what these inventions were. Today, when we look at just the number of keys, people don't agree, right? You have them everywhere, but also different national styles, different times in there. They created very different instruments and very different soundscapes with these instruments. For me, the biggest revelation was when I installed this software on my computer where I could play sampled organs. And for the first time, I could actually play music directly on a historical instrument that was built let's say in 1716 in France, and I could play music from 1716 from France. This was amazing. Finally, I understood why the music was written like that. So it's not just that the instruments were built in the way that they were built. The music was specifically written for these instruments. And that's why it sounds amazing on them. And if you try to recreate it on, let's say, modern piano or like a modern organ or whatever, you cannot get the same amount of detail that you would in the original. Same thing with like Italian organ pieces. Like I found them to be amazingly beautiful because you have just like this one manual, and in this one register you have like 3 or 4 different colors. They were coloring the same register on a keyboard with different ways, so you can have voice separation while just playing on one keyboard. That's so cool. Modern instruments, like everything is equally divided, right? Everything is the same. We talked about this before. After the French Revolution, after kind of democracy set in, we thought, yeah, everybody has the same worth, so let's make everything the same. Tonalities are the same, sounds are the same, everything's the same. Back then, much more individual, which I find to be extremely interesting. Then we have, unfortunately for us, no recorded music. Number 6, no records whatsoever. The only thing that we have remotely are like the barrel organs. So people putting in like holes or like little notches so that you can turn it around and then you can listen to how they set this thing into music. Another question is how fast to turn, right? What's going to be the tempo? Is it really set in a way that it was played? Or was it more of a gimmick and people just enjoy that? These are questions that we can't really answer. They're kind of like these barrel organ recordings from Smith, I think, which was Handel's secretary. So from an actual Handel piece, like how it was played. Very interesting to listen to. Very interesting. I highly encourage you to find that on the internet and check it out. But again, we don't really know. The markings that we have on tempo before even the metronome came out, we have the pendulum from France that they used for dancing, right, to set the tempo for dances, but also then later they used it to set the tempo for music, how it was supposed to be played. And also sometimes it's very easy to figure out which dance was played in what way, because as far as we know, the gravity was the same back then, and if you have to do jumps, you have a very specific kind of time that you can have when you jump and when you get back down. So I think it's maybe 2 to 5 beats per minute that you have play within these jumping dances, and then that's it. Like you need, as a musician, to know how to dance and to hit this so the dancer can do the steps that they're required. So although we don't have any recordings from that time, we can at least a little bit reconstruct the tempo for a specific set of music that was written. But also, just like in between different countries and in between different cities, the cultural exchange, it wasn't easy. You had, if you wanted to hear it firsthand, you had to go there and to experience it. And if you didn't go there, then you had no idea how it actually sounded. People could just describe it to you. Or you could look at sheet music and hopefully suppose that what you are doing was the thing that they intended. That is also why we find these wordings, the prefaces, everything that composers wrote down when they published their music, so others can make sense of it, like what was really going on there. Sheet music was therefore the only way of preservation. And copying it was pretty labor intensive. So if you wanted to, let's say, create a performance, you had, if you wrote down the partitura, if you wrote down the main parts, right, somebody had to copy it for all the other members of the ensemble. So probably also your kids, pupils, and so on. So everybody was just copying music all the time. That was the cheap way to do it. But printing it out was neither practical nor cheap. And even people who were copying music, let's say students that somebody had, they had to pay to be allowed to copy. So you couldn't just go and like, hey, do you mind if I copy this from you? So this is actually how you sold your music. You gave access to something that you wrote so that they can come and copy it by hand. And they would pay you to do that. That is why we have this anecdote where Bach is kind of going in the middle of the night with his brother or cousin, and then he's kind of writing down the sheet music, and then he gets scolded for that, right? This idea was used in the 19th century to romanticize Bach. Oh, you know, he was so into music that he even during the night went and kind of wrote down music because he was just obsessed. Actually, he was kind of stealing, right? So that's the reason why also he got punished for it, like from that anecdote. That was considered stealing because he didn't pay for the works that he was copying from his brother or cousin. Yeah. And also we have this other anecdote from Bach, which was also something that he got punished for because he was just doing his own thing, I guess. What he did was he asked for a leave for like a month, and then he walked famously the 400 kilometers up to Lübeck, to Buxtehude, to just learn from him, to see like that post was written out. He was supposed to retire, and he was looking for somebody to be like his following and so on. So yeah, Bach just went on there and stayed a little bit longer, a couple months longer, and walked that distance by foot, which is crazy. But apparently people did things like that back then. Not everybody, maybe 400 kilometers, but this was just, if you wanted to go and learn firsthand from somebody, that was the way that you did it. And I mean, he knew that there were dangers and that he's probably going to get punished for staying away longer. And he still returned and then faced a month in prison. Like he had arrest for, I think, 30 days because of, well, what he did. Number 7, public theaters were emerging. So this would be Hamburg, London. We have suddenly more and more merchants and like the middle class that is getting established. And that is signaling a cultural shift, right? From earlier performances being exclusive to nobles and courts, composers like Handel, he brought the opera to the, I don't want to say common folk, but the growing middle class. They would go and pay tickets to be present in such a performance. So we have that in London and Hamburg, these becoming increasingly popular, and you have that even like a small competition emerging, and they trying to create like, what are we going to do? What do people like? What are we going to write? What is going to pull in more audience, right? And so this becomes more and more like today we have classical music also asking the same questions. How do we get an audience to come to our concerts? How do we create something that is appealing to the general public? Which is kind of a little bit different to, let's say, what was going on with the patronage system that they had. So usually artists and musicians, they relied entirely on commissions from nobles or from kings or from rulers or from churches. So success depended not just on your talent and your artistic ability to create good music, but to actually fit that music to the taste of who was paying you. And if they were not happy, like if you didn't have this muscle to, here we are, first understand what they want and then create, if you didn't have that, well, that is going to be a problem for you, okay? We have that as point 8, the patronage system, and also here is the fun quote where we have Louis XIV, the Sun King, kind of shaping through his patronage of the arts, he was shaping a complete style that was present in Europe. He more or less created the French style with like the artists that were at his court, that he paid, and that he specifically instructed how to write. Now, we also have cases of these artists falling out of favor from the king, and they didn't live long thereafter. You know probably that Lully was really, really celebrated for a very long time. He was very near the king. And then at a certain point, he was just discarded and then died soon thereafter. It was not really murder, but it was more like an idea of, you could see that the favor of the king, who was called the Sun King, was kind of so important for these people, for their lifestyle, for everything that mattered to them. I mean, Louis died in a very awful way, where he just like with the drumming stick, like where he was giving the tempo for the orchestra, he hit his foot and then he got like blood poisoning and died from that. So really stupid death, basically, just after being discarded by the king not so long ago. So you really had to take care of what your betters were looking for, what was their kind of fashion, their style, what they were interested in, and then compose music for that. Again, the Sun King put this to the extreme, and here we are with the anecdote in the beginning, where he was kind of locking up composers and making them write stuff, like creating the French style. They explained to them how he imagined the French style to be. And then he did the things around the court, and then an hour or a couple hours later, he would come and then they would play for him what they have composed. And he would decide if this was okay to be the French style or if they have to scratch it and start again. This is how much he went into creating music. So not just like saying what he liked and didn't like, he was really, really at the hands of creating that style. And that moves us to the next point, which is number 9, fashionable art styles, but also cultural ideas from back then. So we have artistic styles that were limited to a few dominant trends. You have a little bit a different idea for the Baroque as you have for the Rococo. Either way, the patrons expected artists that they hired to always follow these fashions. And if something new came up, you had to know how to do that. So you had to stay informed on what was going on throughout Europe. And sheet music was sent through all the major cities. Like, there was a cultural exchange going on. And just staying in style was actually so important for them. Again, not just because of the favor that we talked before, But it was a display of power and a display of the God-given rights to the rulers. It was a display of everything. So by having bad musicians, by surrounding yourself with bad art, kind of also meant that you were maybe not a legitimate ruler, or maybe that something wasn't really like the way it's supposed to be. So there's a large pressure on the rulers to like follow these styles, right? And you see everybody copying the kind of palace that they created in Versailles. You can see it throughout Europe, everybody trying to copy the French style of clothing, the French style of dancing. A lot of French dances went on throughout Europe and became popularized. And we have these two large influences for whole Europe. Right? We have France, as we've mentioned, with the Sun King and how he created everything. And before that, Italy was like the major focal point for everybody to look at what culture was doing, how it was doing, because it was this amazingly funded place for art. And so many musicians went there, so many artists went there just to get educated from the actual masters. Because remember, Italy, Renaissance, very, very great time. Very, very many artworks and amazing masters emerged there. So also we have it as the birthplace of opera. We have it, a lot of innovations for instrumental music. All of those come from Italy. And Louis XIV, he kind of saw this happening and he wanted to bring France also to a very new place in Europe, because at the time of his birth, France wasn't necessarily well established politically. It wasn't as grand. It wasn't as, I mean, it was still a big country, but it was, you cannot compare the two. You just can't compare to what he created out of that country. And what he oftentimes did was look at what people were looking for, what people liked, and then he twisted it in a way that it became French, so that he could put like his mark on, or the French mark on it, and then popularize that throughout Europe by creating luxury goods, by making things exclusive. So you could say that he was a master marketer back then, actually, just like how he created that whole empire that shaped Europe and that shaped the style of so many musicians, because they then got the order, hey, I like this French style, compose in the French style. And you can see how that found its place into the art of the 17th and 18th century. Let's go to the last point, which is number 10, that still after all of this that we have going on in culture, peace was rare. And it was not very well seen if you would place yourself, let's say, in the influence of your enemy, if you would navigate the political but also the cultural landscape in a way where you could give legitimation to people that were kind of at war with you, right? So it was not an easy time to navigate, not just politically, culturally, or in everyday life, where people had just to pay attention, not to get drafted, not to get killed on the streets, not to be in a war, because like wars, again, were happening all the time. Death was ever present. But also from a cultural standpoint, the identification with certain styles, with certain countries, with certain rulers, these meant the identification for your people, for your music, and for the things that you created. When we have the 30 Years' War, where there's a lot of killing between Protestants and Catholics, and really, really awful killings, there are certain things that emerged from there that kind of separated the different music styles. There are, but by the way, I really like the work which is called Der abenteuerliche Simplicissimus Deutsch. This is a wonderful, wonderful work where you can go and actually read about the culture and how life was during the 30 Years' War. And it is all explained through the eyes of a very naive young guy, right? And he just doesn't put any interpretations from any side on his stories, but you can actually just like see how he describes it in his own words, and then you make your own picture of the situation and how everything goes on. And then you can also see his character develop throughout the book and becoming more and more wise with everything that is happening. It's a very long book, and it's definitely a very interesting one to check out if you want to learn more about how life was for them and how also they dealt with it, how they coped with it, and to also find this almost sarcastically humorous style of how he was describing horrors back in the day that were happening to the people. So this is all I got for today. I think it's been long enough. It's been really a lot to take in. There are so many small subliminal messages that I also couldn't put in these single parts. So this is just like a more expanded overview over the culture and how work and culture related back in the Baroque era. Obviously, as I've stated, you have very many different time frames in the Baroque era. It's not just like Baroque, that's these 150 years, and we keep it at that. There are very different streams inside of there with the times, but then also with the national styles, with, again, the political situation, what everybody was affiliated with, or whom were they partnering with, and so on. So it's a very complex situation that needs to be studied from composer to composer, like in any singular case. And most of the things that we talked about, they apply to all of them in one way or another. I hope that this gave you a new perspective on Baroque life. I hope that this gives you a very different perspective on the music from that time, on how it is to be performed, how it is to be felt, thought about. If you've learned something new, if you agree or disagree with something, do let me know. Leave a comment. Also, if you like it, this is, first of all, giving me encouragement to do more. And if you want to have more of something, let me know so I can plan accordingly and create content that resonates with you. And second, it's just great to have feedback. Again, I want to listen and to be able to listen. So for me to be able to listen, you need to say something first. And when I have your feedback, when I know what you want, I can adapt accordingly and create content that matters more to you. So thanks for tuning in. This is the Well-Tempered Cast, where we discuss everything Baroque. I'm your host, Nenad Leonart, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care.